On the 14th of March, 2019, at 8:47 p.m., Marcus Webb crossed through the security checkpoint at Denver International Airport. He waved casually at a surveillance camera while putting on his sneakers, a gesture that would be recorded by dozens of lenses scattered throughout the terminal. But what happened in the following minutes would defy all logic. Because Marcus Webb simply ceased to exist inside the most monitored airport in Colorado. And when authorities reviewed the recordings, they discovered something that would make any investigator's blood freeze in their veins. Between 9:52 p.m. and 10:24 p.m., all the cameras in Terminal B, all of them, without exception, had stopped functioning at the same time. Before we continue, if you appreciate investigations that defy all rational explanation, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. This is one of those cases that will stick in your mind for days. Marcus Anthony Webb was 34 years old when he disappeared. Born and raised in Boulder, Colorado, he was the type of man who went unnoticed in a crowd. And this wasn't a criticism, but almost an art form. Standing at one point 78 meters tall, with brown hair that was always slightly disheveled, and black-framed glasses that he had worn since college, Marcus had that discreet engineer air that he in fact possessed. His sisters, Rachel and Jennifer, used to joke that he could disappear in any group photo, not because he was insignificant, but because he had that gift of blending perfectly into his surroundings. But truly, knowing Marcus was to discover layers that completely contradicted that first impression. He worked as a senior software engineer at TechStream Solutions, a medium-sized company in Denver specializing in cybersecurity. His colleagues described him as brilliant, methodical, and surprisingly funny when you got to know him better. Marcus had this dry humor, his best friend and co-worker, David Chen, recalled. He would deliver jokes so subtle that it would take you about 5 seconds to realize it, and then you couldn't stop laughing. Marcus's life was built on precise routines. He woke up every day at 6:15 a.m., made coffee in a French press, always exactly 4 minutes of infusion, and arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m. sharp. On weekends, you would find him climbing in the Flatirons or lost on some trail in the Rocky Mountains. He had a notebook where he recorded every peak he conquered, with the date, weather conditions, and a small reflection. His last entry, dated the 10th of March, 2019, 4 days before his disappearance, read, "Bear Peak, residual snow, perfect visibility. Sometimes you need to be at the top to remember how small the problems down below are." Marcus lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, but alone didn't mean lonely. He had a small but extremely close circle of friends. Bi-weekly dinners with David and his wife Melissa. Weekly phone calls with his mother, Patricia, who had been living in Fort Collins since she became a widow 3 years earlier. And there was something more. In the last 8 months, Marcus had begun dating someone. Sarah Brennan, 31 years old, literature professor at Metropolitan State University. They met in a bookstore. She was looking for something by Murakami. He recommended Kafka on the Shore, and 3 hours of conversation later, she had his number. He was different since he met Sarah, Rachel, his older sister, would recall later with tears in her eyes. Lighter. He was always kind of serious, you know? Too thoughtful. But with her, he smiled more, made plans, talked about the future in a way I had never heard before. And it was exactly about the future that Marcus was thinking on that Thursday, the 14th of March, 2019. He had planned that trip to San Francisco weeks in advance. It was a 3-day conference on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, but it was also an opportunity. Sarah had casually mentioned that she had always wanted to see the Golden Gate Bridge at sunset. Marcus had reserved a hotel with a view of the bay. He had researched restaurants. He had even bought a new camera, a Fuji mirrorless that was still in the box on his desk. On the morning of the 14th, Marcus followed his usual routine. He arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m., participated in 2 meetings, had lunch at the Chipotle on the corner, carnitas bowl, as always, and returned to finish some code before the trip. David remembers passing by his desk at 3:30 p.m. He was listening to music, that jazz playlist he always listened to when he was focused. I asked if he was excited about the trip. He smiled and said, "More than I should be." That was the last thing he said to me. Marcus left work promptly at 5 p.m. He took the RTD to his station, walked the 3 blocks to his apartment, and by 6:20 p.m. his suitcase was already packed. Sarah stopped by around 6:45 p.m. to say goodbye. Her flight to the conference was the next day, so they would meet in San Francisco. What happened during that goodbye would become one of the most analyzed details of the case. Sarah would describe later. I kissed him and said, "Don't disappear on me." It was a silly joke, because he always arrived early for everything. He laughed and said, "Never. God." He said, "Never." At 7:15 p.m., Marcus ordered an Uber. The driver, James Sullivan, a 52-year-old man who drove to supplement his retirement, picked Marcus up in front of the building. He seemed normal, James would tell police later. Calm, polite. Checked his cell phone a few times during the ride. We talked a bit about traffic, about the weather. Nothing memorable, you know. Just another passenger going to the airport. The trip took 38 minutes. At 7:53 p.m., James dropped Marcus off at the entrance to Terminal B of Denver International Airport. And it was here that Marcus Webb's night began to unravel in ways that no one, not even the most experienced investigators, would be able to fully explain. Denver International Airport is a fortress of surveillance. With more than 3,000 security cameras, real-time monitoring systems, and security teams circulating 24 hours a day, it is theoretically impossible for someone to simply disappear. But on the night of the 14th of March, 2019, the impossible was about to happen. Marcus entered through the main gate of Terminal B at 7:54 p.m. The external cameras captured everything. Him wearing a navy blue North Face jacket, dark jeans, gray Nike sneakers, pulling a black Samsonite carry-on suitcase with a red tag that Sarah had given him as a gift. He stopped at the United Airlines automatic check-in counter at 7:57 p.m. The cameras show him interacting with the screen for approximately 3 minutes. At 8:00 p.m., he printed his boarding pass, Flight UA 1247 to San Francisco, with departure scheduled for 10:35 p.m., Seat 14C. The atmosphere inside the airport was that of a typical Thursday night. Moderate movement, families returning from spring break vacations, tired executives returning home. The outside temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, but a warm front was arriving, promising rain for the early morning. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that could predict what was to come. At 8:08 p.m., Marcus entered the security line. This is a crucial detail. Several TSA agents remember him, not for any suspicious behavior, but precisely for the absence of anything memorable. He went through normally, reported Agent Jessica Morales. He took out his laptop, took off his shoes, passed through the metal detector without problems. Polite. Thank you. Have a good flight. Standard. The cameras confirm. At 8:13 p.m., Marcus was already on the other side of security, putting his sneakers back on and waving casually at the camera above him. And then he did something interesting. Something that would later be dissected in endless investigation meetings. Instead of going directly to his gate, Gate B47, a walk of perhaps 12 minutes, Marcus turned left and walked toward the food court. The cameras follow him. 8:16 p.m. He passes by a souvenir shop. 8:19 p.m. He stops in front of a Starbucks but doesn't enter. 8:21 p.m. He is sitting on a bench near the bathrooms using his cell phone. Phone records show that at 8:23 p.m., Marcus sent a message to Sarah. At the airport, Gate B47. Arrived early as always. See you tomorrow. With a heart emoji. Sarah responded immediately. Of course you arrived early. With a smiling emoji. Safe flight, my love. At 8:27 p.m., Marcus made a call lasting 2 minutes and 34 seconds to his mother. Patricia Webb would remember every word of that conversation. He said everything was fine, that the flight was on time. He asked how I was, if I had taken my blood pressure medication. He always asked that. I said yes. He said, I love you, Mom. I said, I love you too, dear. Normal. It was all so normal. At 8:31 p.m., the cameras show Marcus getting up from the bench and walking toward the men's restrooms. He enters. This is an important point. He enters the bathroom at 8:31 p.m. and 42 seconds, according to the timestamp. The cameras don't record the interior of bathrooms, basic privacy, but they record entry and exit. At 8:35 p.m. and 18 seconds, Marcus exits. 4 minutes in the bathroom. Normal time. He was still wearing the navy blue jacket, still pulling his suitcase. And here is where the night begins to become disturbing. Marcus begins walking toward Gate B47. But the path he chooses is strange. Instead of following the main route, clear and direct, he turns down a side corridor, a less busy area that leads to the same gates, but by a longer path. Why? This would never be answered. At 8:38 p.m., a camera captures him in this corridor. There are 3 other people visible in the frame. A man in a suit talking on the phone, an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair being pushed by an airport employee, and a teenage girl with headphones. At 8:41 p.m., Marcus stops again. The cameras show him turning his head, looking behind him, as if he had heard something or felt that someone was following him. He stands still for almost a full minute, and then he looks directly at the camera. Not a casual glance. He stares fixedly at the lens for 8 seconds. 8 seconds that would be analyzed infinitely. What was he thinking? Had he seen something? Felt something? At 8:43 p.m., Marcus resumes walking. He turns right at another junction, now definitely approaching the area of gates B40 through B50. The cameras continue recording. 8:47 p.m., he passes by a duty-free shop. 8:49 p.m., he is less than 100 meters from gate B47. 8:51 p.m., the last clear camera captures him walking through the main corridor of the gates. And then, at 9:52 p.m., exactly 1 hour and 1 minute later, something impossible happened. All 47. Security cameras in the Terminal B section simply stopped functioning. It wasn't a power blackout. The lights remained on, the stores continued operating, the gate computers functioned normally. It was exclusively the camera system, as if someone or something had cut only the surveillance. And when the cameras came back to functioning at 10:24 p.m., exactly 32 minutes later, Marcus Webb was no longer anywhere in the airport. His suitcase gone. His cell phone, which until 8:51 p.m. was still emitting a signal connected to the airport Wi-Fi, was now completely offline. Marcus simply ceased to exist. Flight UA-1247 to San Francisco took off at 10:42 p.m. with seat 14C empty. And during those 32 minutes of digital darkness, something happened to Marcus Webb that no one witnessed, no one recorded, and no one would be able to explain. The missing person alert was not triggered immediately because no one knew there was something wrong. Sarah only realized something was strange the following morning, Friday the 15th of March, when she landed in San Francisco and saw that Marcus had not boarded the flight and wasn't responding to messages. She called the hotel. He never checked in. She called David. He had no news. That was when the first real chill of fear ran down her spine. At 11:30 a.m. on Friday morning, Sarah called Denver airport security. Initially, there was some reluctance. Adults have the right to change their minds, to miss flights, to disappear for a while. But there was something in Sarah's voice, an absolute certainty that something was terribly wrong, that made Officer Matthew Reeves take the case seriously. She said, "He wouldn't simply miss a flight. You don't understand. Marcus doesn't do these things," Reeves would recall. And there was an intensity in how she said it that made me believe her. At 2 p.m., an airport security team began reviewing the recordings. And that's when they discovered the first impossibility. Those 32 minutes of absolute silence from 47 cameras. The airport security coordinator, Thomas Brennan, turned visibly pale when he saw the timestamps. In 23 years working with airport security, he would tell investigators later, "I have never, not even once, seen anything like this. Cameras fail. It happens. But all of them at the same time, in a specific area, and then they magically come back to functioning? This isn't technical failure. This is something else." The Webb family was notified at 4 p.m. that Friday afternoon. Patricia Webb collapsed. Rachel canceled a work flight and immediately drove from Chicago to Denver. Jennifer, the younger sister who lived in Seattle, was on a plane at 6 p.m. At 8 p.m. on the night of the 15th of March, less than 24 hours after Marcus had disappeared, his family was gathered in a cold conference room at Denver International Airport, looking at two officers who had no answers. "How does someone disappear inside an airport?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. "How?" And that was precisely the question that would leave investigators completely perplexed. Because the most logical answer, that Marcus had left the airport, didn't make sense. To leave, he would have to return through security. And all those cameras were functioning perfectly. There was no record of him going toward the exits. None. So if he didn't leave through security, the only other exits would be restricted areas, emergency doors that would trigger alarms, maintenance areas that required electronic badges, or the runways. And the thought that Marcus could have accessed the runways with all the existing security seemed absurd. But the absurd was quickly becoming the only option that remained. On Saturday, the 16th of March, the search began in full force. Security teams reviewed every inch of Terminal B. Sniffer dogs were brought in. Every store, every bathroom, every maintenance closet was checked. One of the most painful images from that first weekend was Patricia Webb walking through the airport with a printed photo of Marcus, showing it to strangers. "Have you seen my son? Please, have you seen my son?" The Boulder and Denver community responded with impressive speed. Within 48 hours, there were volunteer search groups, Facebook pages with thousands of members, and flyers with Marcus's face on practically every telephone. Pole within a 50-kilometer radius of the airport. But all these efforts ran into a frustrating reality. You can't search for someone when you have no idea where to start. David Chen organized vigils. TechStream Solutions co-workers offered a $50,000 reward for information. Sarah spent 72 hours without sleeping, reviewing and reviewing Marcus's last messages, looking for clues she knew didn't exist. "I kept reading, 'See you tomorrow,' with that heart," she would say months later. "As if I looked at it long enough, he would somehow appear." Airport security quickly passed the case to the FBI. Disappearances in international airports become a federal matter. Special Agent Carla Morrison took the case on Sunday, the 17th of March. Her first action was to examine that 32-minute void in the recordings. Digital forensics experts were brought in. What they discovered brought no comfort, only more questions. The camera system had not been hacked, at least, not in any conventional way they could detect. There was no obvious malicious code, no clear intrusion into the servers, no sign of traditional remote access. The cameras simply stopped recording data, as if something had physically interrupted their ability to function, but only for that specific period, and only in that specific area. One of the technicians, speaking unofficially, said, "It's as if someone knew exactly where and when to create a blind spot. But the precision necessary for that shouldn't be possible without leaving traces." Theories began to proliferate, each one more disturbing than the last. Marcus had been the victim of a planned crime, and the perpetrators had intimate knowledge of the security system. But how? And why? Marcus wasn't rich. He had no known enemies. He wasn't involved in anything that would justify this level of planning. Another theory: Marcus had a parallel life, was running from something, and orchestrated his own disappearance. But his family, his friends, his girlfriend, all swore this was impossible. And even if it were true, how would he have disabled the cameras? There was a third possibility that no one wanted to verbalize, but that was on everyone's mind. Marcus had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen at the wrong moment, and someone with resources to manipulate security systems had ensured he couldn't talk about it. Marcus's phone records were exhaustively analyzed. Nothing suspicious. His finances were reviewed. No unusual transactions, no large cash withdrawals, nothing suggesting planning. His apartment was searched with a warrant, his laptop, his documents, every inch of his private life exposed. What they found was the life of a profoundly normal man. Bills paid, a refrigerator with milk about to expire, that new camera still in the box on the desk, a post-it on the refrigerator that said, "Remember Sarah about Friday dinner." A man who had plans, a future. But there was something that caught the investigators' attention. On Marcus's laptop, there were recent searches in the browser history, dated from 1 week before the disappearance, between the 7th and 9th of March. The searches were about surveillance systems, specifically about vulnerabilities in security cameras, about how CCTV systems work, about failures in facial recognition technology. When this information leaked, and it inevitably leaked, some began to speculate that perhaps Marcus had planned his disappearance. But David Chen, when confronted with this theory, had an immediate reaction. Marcus was a cybersecurity engineer. Researching surveillance systems was literally part of his job. He was preparing a presentation for the conference about vulnerabilities in airport infrastructure. And he was right. When investigators reviewed Marcus's work emails, there it was, a slide deck in preparation, titled Critical vulnerabilities in public transportation security systems, scheduled for presentation on the second day of the conference in San Francisco. The searches weren't suspicious. They were work. But the coincidence was disturbing. Marcus was researching exactly the type of vulnerability that would have allowed someone to create that blind spot in the cameras. This raised a frightening possibility. What if Marcus had discovered something in his research? Some real vulnerability that someone didn't want exposed? What if those 32 minutes weren't just about making Marcus disappear, but about preventing him from sharing what he had discovered? But if this theory were true, why not simply cancel his presentation? Why this elaborate staging? And more importantly, where was the body? In the months that followed, Marcus Webb's case slowly began to fade from the headlines. Not because it had been solved, but because there was nothing new to report. The FBI investigation continued, but there were fewer and fewer leads to follow. Every airport employee that night was interviewed. Every passenger in Terminal B who could be identified was contacted. Cameras from establishments near the airport were reviewed. Nothing. It was as if, in those 32 minutes, Marcus Webb had simply ceased to exist on the physical plane. Sarah Brennan never went to San Francisco. She took medical leave from the university and spent the next months completely consumed by the search. She created a website, documenting every detail of the case, posting updates, appealing for any information. The site had millions of visits in that first year, but hundreds of sightings led to dead ends. Marcus in Phoenix, in Portland, in Toronto, all checked, all empty. Patricia Webb visibly aged in that first year. The vibrant woman Marcus had called on the night of the 14th of March became a shadow. Rachel temporarily moved to Denver to care for her mother, dividing her time between Fort Collins and her own life in Chicago. Jennifer flew to Colorado every few weeks. The Webb sisters became fervent advocates not just to find Marcus, but to expose what they saw as catastrophic failures in airport security. They want us to believe that 47 cameras failing at the same time was just an unfortunate technical problem, Rachel said in an interview in August of 2019. But my brother disappeared during this technical problem. If this was really just an accident, then every airport in the United States has critical vulnerabilities. And if it wasn't an accident, then someone knows what happened. Denver International Airport faced severe scrutiny. Audits were conducted. Systems were updated. But officially, the conclusion was that there was a synchronization failure in the server during a routine update. It was a technical explanation that sounded plausible to laypeople, but not to experts. Backup servers fail, yes, but redundant systems exist precisely to prevent this type of total failure. And even if all the backups failed, simultaneously, you wouldn't see the cameras all coming back at the same time, perfectly synchronized. That's not how technical failures work. On the 14th of March, 2020, on the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, more than 500 people gathered in Terminal B of Denver International Airport for a vigil. Sarah was there, holding a photo of Marcus, that same photo that Patricia had printed on the first weekend. Candles were lit, and for the first time, publicly, Patricia Webb said the words that no one wanted to hear. I just need to know what happened to my son. Even if he's no longer here, I need to know. Because this was the particular torture of the Webb case. Without a body, without evidence of crime, without any indication of what had happened, the family was trapped in a horrible limbo. Marcus wasn't dead, not officially, but he also wasn't alive in any way that mattered. His bank accounts remained untouched. His apartment which Sarah and the family finally had to empty in June of 2020, was exactly as he had left it. The camera still in the box, the yellowed post-it on the refrigerator. In October of 2021, the FBI formally classified the case as inactive, still open, but without active leads being pursued. Agent Morrison had retired. The case was reassigned, but with reduced priority. Calls to the family became less frequent. The second anniversary vigil attracted perhaps 100 people. The third, 30. Not because people stopped caring, but because the absence of progress is a form of slow and painful forgetting. Sarah eventually returned to teaching, but she never really moved forward. "How do you move forward when there's no closure?" she told a friend. "Marcus is somewhere. He exists in some form, in some state. I just don't know where or how. And not knowing is worse than any answer could be." And then, on the 7th of April, 2024, 5 years and almost 1 month after Marcus Webb's disappearance, something happened that would make the case explode back into public attention in a way no one could have anticipated. A maintenance worker named Miguel Hernandez was doing routine service in an underground utilities area of Denver International Airport, specifically in the section that connects Terminal B to the underground train system. This area, more than 20 meters below the main terminal level, rarely received human traffic. It was mainly pipes, electrical cabling, ventilation systems. Miguel was checking a pressure valve when his flashlight illuminated something that shouldn't be there. Navy blue fabric. He approached. What he saw made his stomach turn. It was a jacket. A navy blue North Face jacket. And beneath it, partially hidden behind a large ventilation pipe, was a suitcase. A black Samsonite suitcase with a faded red tag. Miguel didn't touch anything. He immediately called security. At 2:33 p.m. on the 7th of April, 2024, the area was cordoned off. At 3:10 p.m., federal agents were on site. At 4:45 p.m., the Webb family received a call they had simultaneously hoped for and feared for 5 years. Some of Marcus's belongings had been found. The jacket and suitcase were sent for forensic analysis. What they discovered was simultaneously enlightening and deeply disturbing. The jacket was torn on the left sleeve, an irregular tear of approximately 15 centimeters. There were stains that tested positive for blood, type A positive, consistent with Marcus's blood type. But the amount was small, equivalent to what you would see from a superficial cut or scratch, not from serious injury. The suitcase revealed even more mysteries. It was locked, but was opened by forensic technicians. Inside were clothes folded with meticulous care. He was obsessively organized. Toiletries. A book, The Overstory, by Richard Powers, with a bookmark on page 83. And on the inside front of the suitcase, written in black pen directly on the lining, was something that made the investigators stop. Numbers: 38472219195. 12 digits. No obvious explanation. The handwriting was confirmed by experts as being Marcus's. But what did they mean? They weren't valid geographical coordinates. They didn't correspond to any phone or bank account of Marcus's. They weren't dates in any obvious format. Cryptography experts were consulted. Dozens of theories were proposed. Some suggested they could be references to book pages, a kind of literary cipher. Others thought they could be codes for some type of safe or locker. But nothing was conclusively proven. But the most disturbing discovery came when technicians examined the exact location where the jacket and suitcase were found. That underground area was accessible through 3 doors, all locked with electronic badges that recorded every entry and exit. Records were reviewed for the 14th of March, 2019. Between 6 p.m. and midnight, only 7 people accessed that area. 4 maintenance employees, 2 electrical technicians, and 1 security supervisor. All were re-interviewed. All had solid alibis for their activities that night, and none of them saw Marcus Webb or anything unusual. So how did Marcus's jacket and suitcase get to an area that required authorized access? And more importantly, where was the rest? Where was his cell phone, his wallet, his work laptop that he always took on trips? Where was Marcus? The underground area was completely searched. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar cameras were used to check walls and floors. Weeks of intensive searching. And they found nothing more. No other belongings. No sign of Marcus. It was as if the jacket and suitcase had been deliberately placed there, but only that. Only enough to reopen wounds without bringing answers. The discovery officially reopened the case. New agents were assigned. The media returned with force. But 5 years of a cold trail were almost impossible to warm up again. Witnesses had weakened memories. Evidence had degraded. And those 32 minutes of void in the cameras remained as inexplicable in 2024 as they had been in 2019. A new line of investigation emerged. What if Marcus had somehow witnessed something he shouldn't have seen? What if, on that walk through the side corridor at 8:41 p.m., when he stopped and looked back, when he fixed his gaze on that camera for 8 seconds, what if at that moment he had seen something that put him in danger? It could explain why the cameras were disabled, not necessarily for Marcus's disappearance, but because something else was happening in that terminal, something that required that surveillance void, and Marcus was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this raised even darker questions. What could be happening in an international airport that would justify this level of coordination? Additional forensic analysis on the jacket revealed small synthetic fibers that didn't match anything Marcus was wearing that night. The fibers were identified as consistent with certain types of industrial carpet, the type used in maintenance and utilities areas. This confirmed that Marcus, or at least his jacket, had in fact been in that underground space at some point. But here was something truly baffling. The jacket and suitcase didn't show signs of having been in that humid and dusty environment for 5 years. The deterioration was inconsistent with prolonged exposure. Some technicians, speaking unofficially, suggested that the items appeared to have been there for months, not years, which raised the terrifying possibility. What if these items had been stored elsewhere and deliberately placed in that location in 2024 to be found? If this were true, it meant that someone still had information about the case. Someone who knew where Marcus was or what had happened to him, and was choosing to reveal information in a gradual and calculated manner. Today, in November of 2025, Marcus Webb's case remains officially open, but without resolution in sight. The investigation produced thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of interviews, extensive forensic analyses, and precisely 0 definitive conclusions about what happened in those 32 minutes of the 14th of March, 2019. The predominant theories among investigators are divided, none satisfactory. Marcus was the victim of some type of crime, perpetrated by someone with intimate knowledge of airport security. The jacket and suitcase were deliberately planted years later, but without clear motive, without suspect, and without explanation of how the cameras were disabled with such precision. Another possibility: Marcus had some type of acute undiagnosed medical episode. He entered an altered state accessed restricted areas in an unregistered manner, and suffered some collapse in a location still not discovered in the vast underground labyrinth of the airport. The numbers he wrote were a product of confusion. But there was no history of medical problems, and how would he have passed through doors that require electronic badges? The third theory, the most disturbing. Marcus discovered or witnessed something he shouldn't have, was silenced by individuals with resources to manipulate security systems, and his disappearance was part of something larger that will never be completely revealed. And there's a fourth possibility that haunts everyone involved, that we simply will never know. That some disappearances defy explanation because the crucial elements are lost forever, hidden in those 32 minutes of digital void that can never be recovered. Sarah Brennan still maintains the website. She never married. "How could I?" she said recently. "I don't know if I'm a widow or abandoned or waiting. Marcus is a ghost who still breathes somewhere in my life." She visits the airport a few times a year, walking through the same corridors Marcus walked, trying to feel some remnant of connection. Patricia Webb passed away in June of 2025, her heart finally giving up after years of pain without resolution. Rachel and Jennifer scattered her ashes in the Flatirons, one of Marcus's favorite places to climb. There was no body of her son to place alongside, so they created a memorial. A small plaque in the mountains with his name and the dates, Marcus A. Webb, 1984 through 2019, leaving the end ambiguous, because the truth was ambiguous. David Chen still works at TechStream Solutions. Marcus's desk remained empty for 2 years before finally being assigned to someone else. David says he still, sometimes, turns to make a comment, forgetting for a moment. "It's the lack of closure that kills you," he said. "It's the not knowing that corrodes everything." Denver International Airport implemented massive changes to its security systems after the Webb case. Redundant systems were multiplied. Protocols were rewritten. But all this seems performative when no one can satisfactorily explain what went wrong that night. And there are employees who avoid certain areas of Terminal B, especially the underground utilities spaces, where the jacket was found. There are stories, unofficial, whispered during coffee breaks, of inexplicable technical anomalies in that area. Doors found unlocked when they should be secure. Sensors that trigger for no apparent reason. The truth is that Marcus Anthony Webb entered Terminal B of Denver International Airport at 7:54 p.m. on the night of the 14th of March, 2019. He waved to his mother. He sent a love message to his girlfriend. He walked through corridors full of people, going places, living lives, completely unaware that they were witnessing the last recorded moments of a man about to become one of the most baffling mysteries of recent years. And then, at some point between 9:52 p.m. and 10:24 p.m., while 47 cameras inexplicably stopped functioning, Marcus Webb ceased to exist in all measurable ways. He became absence. He became those 12 digits without explanation. 384722191952. Written, with his own hand in a moment of anguish we will never understand. He became 32 minutes of digital silence that can never be filled. What happened to Marcus Webb? 6 years later, with all the resources of federal investigation, with millions of dollars spent on analysis, with the attention of experts across the country, with cutting-edge forensic technology, no one knows. And the most disturbing possibility is that perhaps no one will ever know. Airports are places of transition where people exist between destinations, between identities, between who they were when they entered and who they will be when they leave. They are liminal spaces where normal rules seem suspended. And perhaps, on that March night in Denver, something happened in that liminal space that defies our ordered understanding of how the world works. Marcus Webb was 34 years old. He liked French press coffee and mountain climbing. He was brilliant and kind and was in love. He had plans for Friday and a future he was eager to live. And then he entered an airport, and the universe, or someone in it, decided that he simply wouldn't leave. The case continues officially open. Theoretically, new evidence could emerge at any moment. But with each passing year, with each anniversary marked by an increasingly smaller vigil, with each family member aging under the weight of not knowing, the possibility of answers diminishes. And Marcus Webb remains where he has always been since that night, somewhere between being here and being disappeared, between life and death, between known and eternally mysterious. A man who simply walked into 32 minutes of darkness and never returned. And those 32 minutes remain empty. A black hole in recorded reality that swallowed a man and all the secrets of what really happened to him on that night in March of 2019.